Welcome to Biology 160, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology, talking about the digestive system. In this part of the lecture, we're going to look at the small intestine, large intestine, and then if we have time, we'll get into some of the accessory organs of the digestive system. So the small intestine, this is the main place the digestion happens. Up until now, we've been looking at the mouth and the pharynx, the esophagus, and their job is mainly to partially break up the food in the mouth, begin some chemical digestion, but in large it's to get the food down into the small intestine. The stomach does have some digestive mechanisms in mechanical and chemical, but this small intestine, this is where most of it happens, and this is also where the absorption into the blood happens as well. So small intestine is quite long, and it's a muscular tube that goes from the end of the stomach, the pyloric region, clear down to the beginning of the large intestine at what we call the ileocecal valve. And it's attached to the abdominal wall, the back of the abdominal wall, by the mesentery, as we saw in this earlier picture. And let me pull it up again to remind you here. Here we are. So as you look at this, we can see the small intestine in here. It shows it a few times as it's wrapping around and around and around, all tangled up. And you can see the mesentery here is holding that small intestine, attaching it to the abdominal wall, holding it there. The small intestine has three divisions. The first one's called the duodenum, and this is the shortest part of the small intestine. It only makes up about 5% of the total length. If in a cadaver, when you pull the small intestine out, it can be over 20 feet long. But in a live human, it's a little bit shorter because of the muscle tone. But the small intestine is a very long organ, and that allows it to do digestion. So as we go through the small intestine here, I want you to recognize the surface area that is available here in the small intestine. So the idea is that the more surface area you have, the more area you have to absorb the nutrients and also to digest the food that you're coming in contact with. And so we'll look at a number of things that are there that are set up to increase the surface area of the small intestine. The duodenum comes out of the stomach, curves around the head of the pancreas, and its name actually means 12 finger widths. So that's about how long it is. It's not very long at all. But it's very important because this is where most of the digestive enzymes are going to enter the small intestine. This is where the pancreas is going to attach. And the pancreas is the organ that is producing most of the enzymes that are doing the active digestion. So here's our pancreas. Notice how it's situated right next to the duodenum. As the duodenum exits the stomach, comes off of the stomach, and it's going to wrap around the end of the pancreas, and this is where the pancreas has ducts that are attached to the small intestine, and that's where it's going to dump in all the enzymes. This is also where the gallbladder comes into play, as it also dumps its contents, which are actually produced in the liver. The gallbladder itself is only a storage site, but the bile that's produced in the liver comes down, and it's also going to empty into the duodenum. And so you see all these things coming in, and this is where the digestion really starts ramping up as it then moves into the jejunum, which is the next section of the small intestine. Notice here also that the pancreas, the glands coming from the pancreas to the small intestine, have some sphincters. They can shut off the flow of enzymes into the small intestine. Okay, the jejunum attaches anteriorly to the duodenum, and it makes up about 40% of the length of the small intestine. And then finally we have the ileum, which goes from the jejunum to the large intestine, and it attaches to the part of the large intestine called the cecum, and we call that area the ileocecum sphincter. There's a sphincter at that point separating the small and the large intestine. all food absorption happens in the small intestine as well, as we mentioned. So now we're going to look at some of the things that make absorption possible. So there's the muscle layers of the small intestine that help to move the food along and also to churn it and break it up as well. And then, so the first thing that allows for absorption is the length of the small intestine. So it's very long. The next thing, we have folds in the small intestine. And you can see those located here. Different than the rugae in the stomach, as the small intestine fills up with food, these folds do not disappear because they're here to increase the surface area. So because we have this folding, that provides a lot more area to come in contact with the food to digest and absorb it. Next we have things called villi, and you can see them here. And these are finger-like projections within the folds of the small intestine that also help to increase the surface area. And then finally we have what are called microvilli. So if you take these finger-like projections and you look at them on a cellular level, each of the cells, which this outer layer of cells in the small intestine is mostly made up of simple columnar epithelial cells. Each of those simple columnar cells also has little finger-like projections on the ends of the cells at a microscopic level to increase the surface area for absorption. And here we can see the cells. So on the villi, here's our columnar cell here. And on this end of the cell, you have these little finger-like projections, and they're increasing the surface area. So I've heard it said before that if you were to take the small intestine and spread it out so that you're spreading out all the surface area, even clear down to these microvilli, that surface area could cover something like a tennis court or something like that. So all this surface area, this huge amount of surface area, is packed into our abdomen by all this folding and packing, and that allows us to do the absorption that we need to pull in all of our food. At the beginning of the small intestine in the jejunum, we're going to have a lot more folding, and as we move along the small intestine, that folding is going to decrease until by the time we get to the end, there's not much folding. On the other hand, lymphatic tissue is going to become more abundant as we get to the end of the small intestine. And that makes, as you think about that, that makes sense, because at the beginning of the small intestine, we're doing a lot of digestion and absorption, so we want a lot of surface area. By the time we get to the end, now most of the food has been absorbed and digested, and so now we want to work on making sure that the bacteria and things that are left over that we didn't digest are gotten rid of, so that they're not going to infect our body. Let's now move on to the large intestine. So large intestine is different than the small intestine in a few respects. First of all, it's bigger, it's shorter, it wraps around, almost forms a frame around the small intestine, and it frames the internal abdomen as well. It doesn't have any of the folding that the small intestine does, because its job isn't as much to absorb or digest, do any mechanical digestion, and so the food is simply moving through the small intestine. We are absorbing some things, mainly water, and but we're preparing what's left over to be defecated from the body. So you can see the parts of the large intestine here. Here's the ileocecal valve. So this is where we're coming out of the small intestine, and we're now going to enter the large intestine. And this would be on the right side of the body over here. At this point we have what's called the cecum. It's the beginning of the large intestine. Coming off the cecum we have the appendix. Now the appendix is an interesting little organ. In evolution, this is basically a leftover organ. If you look at other mammals, the cecum is very large, such as in horses, and that's where digestion of materials like grasses and cellulose fiber that we can't digest ourselves is digested by bacteria and those types of organisms. We don't have any of those digestive functions, and so our appendix is kind of left over. It doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't have a function anymore. There is a lot of lymphatic tissue here. It may house some bacteria, some good bacteria, so there are some functions here, but it can be very dangerous if it becomes infected or it bursts, and that bacteria gets into the abdominal cavity. Can be life-threatening. And so if you have your appendix removed, it doesn't really affect you adversely, but if it bursts, it can be a big problem. So here's our cecum, and then we have what's called the ascending colon, and then it turns, and then we have the transverse colon, and then it turns again, and we have the descending colon. Then we reach what's called the sigmoid colon, because of the shape here. Has this little sigmoid shape. And then we have the rectum, and then we come to the colon to the anus at the end. You can see the mesentery here in the middle, and this is what attaches the large intestine to the abdominal wall to hold that there. We can see down here at the end we have sphincters. They can be open and closed to allow the movement, the passage of material out of our large intestine. The sphincter here is made up of both a skeletal muscle and smooth muscle. So there's an outer skeletal muscle which you can control, and then there's an inner smooth muscle which is involuntary control. So it's a combination of voluntary and involuntary control, releasing material from the large intestine. We also have what are called the teniae coli, and these are muscle that has been reduced from what we see in the small intestine, so not as muscular as the small intestine, but because these are somewhat contracted most of the time, we end up with kind of this puckering of the large intestine, and we call this the haustra. So this kind of bulging of the small intestine caused by this muscle layer that's going along the large intestine. So those are the organs of the alimentary canal. Let's now move in and look at the accessory organs, accessory parts of the digestive system. And this is the teeth, the salivary glands, the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder, and what they're doing in digestion. You can see here where these are located. We have our teeth, of course, in our mouth. We have the salivary glands here that we'll look at. And then down below we have the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas is located here. So let's first look at the teeth. As humans, we have two sets of teeth, what we sometimes call our baby teeth, and then our permanent teeth. Another name for them is also deciduous, or milk teeth. And this set of teeth is all gonna fall out at some point. There's a few different types of teeth. Let's look at the adult teeth here. You can see the difference in numbers in the molars, and it tells the years when these start to appear. But there's four basic types of teeth. There's incisors, there's canines, there's what we call premolars, and then there's molars. And these different teeth have different functions, and you can tell by their size and their shape what their job really is. So incisors, in humans we have two sets of incisors. The way you can look at this here is you can split the mouth right down the middle. So this side is going to be a mirror image of this side, and the top's going to look exactly the same. So here's our two incisors on this side. That's going to be matched on top, and it's going to be matched on the other side, and on the top of the other side as well. So we have two incisors, and therefore cutting food. And then we have the canines, which are pointed teeth. We just have one canine on each section of our mouth, and the canine is pointed for ripping and tearing. The premolars and molars are then flattened, grooved teeth that are used for crushing and grinding. Different animals have different types of teeth. You can tell by their types of teeth what types of food they eat. We do have canines, so we're not necessarily strictly vegetarians. If you look at things like cows, horses, in general, they don't have any canines, functional canines to speak of, but they do have incisors and molars. We're omnivores because the way our molars are formed, as well as the fact that we have canines and these incisors. You can see here the parts of a tooth. We have what's called the crown, which is the upper portion that you can see that is sticking above the gums, and it's covered by a very hard substance called enamel. This is the hardest organic substance that is produced by an organism, which is a good thing because our teeth are used for growth. We use our teeth a lot. It can be worn down, and also it can be affected by bacteria and things like that. But as long as we keep our teeth nice and clean and use them well, we'll have this very hard enamel throughout our life. It's not living. Underneath that we have the dentin, which is softer, and then below that we have the pulp cavity. And this is where the blood vessels and the nerves come in, because our tooth is a living part of our body, only the enamel is not living, and so this pulp cavity is there to bring the nourishment and things that we need. We have the neck region, which is going to be where the gums, or the gingiva, are going to meet with the tooth, and then finally we have the root, which is down below, underneath the gums. We also have cementum here, which holds the tooth in place inside the bone of our jaw. The root canal is where the blood vessels and things are coming up into the pulp cavity. And if you've ever had a root canal, basically what they're doing is they're coming in and they're pulling out all this inside the pulp cavity and filling it in, so your tooth isn't really going to be a living tooth anymore. But because it's become infected, you have to go in and do that. And so this is where the nerve endings are as well that cause it to hurt. So that's a little bit about the teeth. Let's now look at the salivary glands. There's three types of glands, three pairs of glands in the mouth. We have the parotid glands, the submandibular glands, and the sublingual glands. And you can see where they're located here as you're looking at this picture. Here's the parotid gland, sublingual gland, and the submandibular gland down below that. The collective job of these salivary glands is to produce saliva. And saliva is a mixture of mucus and serous fluids. There are some enzymes that are in the saliva. The parotid gland, all of them secrete their saliva into the mouth. The parotid gland secretes it into the top of the mouth, and it's just in front of the ears. And that's where mumps comes in as well. So the parotid gland can become infected by the mumps virus, which you get these enlarged. The virus attacks those glands, and so you get these enlarged cheeks, and we call that the mumps. The submandibular glands and the sublingual glands, they empty their saliva into the bottom of the mouth. As the saliva comes in between the action of our teeth and the mastication and the saliva mixing with that food, it forms what we call a bolus. And this bolus is what's going to leave the mouth and go down the esophagus into the stomach, which will later become chyme. There are some enzymes, as I mentioned. We have what's called amylase, which is an enzyme that begins starch digestion. We'll talk about it more later when we talk about chemical digestion. And there's also other chemicals there that help us to taste. And there's at least one other enzyme that's effective in digestion. This brings us to the pancreas, the gallbladder, and liver. Pancreas, we already talked a little bit about it, produces enzymes that are going to dump into the duodenum where the digestion can start. And it produces enzymes that break down every category of food: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, and nucleic acids. So it breaks that all down. It also releases some substances that neutralize the acidic conditions that are coming from the stomach. So the enzymes of the pancreas have to work at a more basic pH, and so as that acidic chyme is coming into the small intestine, the pancreas releases bicarbonate that neutralizes the acid coming from the stomach. This is how the pancreas acts as an exocrine gland. So these enzymes that it's producing, notice how they're going into a duct and they're emptying into the outside of the body, and we call that an exocrine gland. It also works as an endocrine gland, as we've seen before, producing insulin and glucagon, which affect the sugar levels inside our blood. Then we have the gallbladder. The gallbladder stores bile, which is produced by the liver. And as the liver produces bile and sends it down these hepatic ducts, which come down and empty into the duodenum. If the sphincter is closed so that no bile can come into the duodenum, if the sphincter is shut off, then the bile will move back up, but instead of going back into the liver, we don't want to go back in the liver, it enters into the gallbladder, and there it's stored until we need to go through digestion. Then it can contract, and it can squeeze the bile down into the duodenum. So bile contains what we call bile salts. It also contains pigments, mainly bilirubin, which comes from the breakdown of red blood cells and the hemoglobin in them. It also contains cholesterol, phospholipids, and some electrolytes. Bile salts are the ones that are active in digestion, though. And so the bile salts break down large lipid globules into smaller pieces of fats and oils, so that when we get down farther in the smaller intestine, they can be digested more fully and absorbed into the body. So that's its job there. This is produced by the liver again, and the liver is the largest organ, the largest gland inside the body. Very important both in digestion, but in other parts of the body as well. You can't live very long without your liver. It's very important for that reason. There are some things that can go wrong with the liver. You can get things called gallstones that happen when the bile in the gallbladder is there too long, and it starts to crystallize and form into mineralized stones, which can be painful, and some people have the gallbladder removed. So you can have your gallbladder removed and still function relatively normally, since it's just basically a storage container. Also, if this little duct gets clogged for some reason, the bile can no longer get into the small intestine and may back up eventually into the liver. That can become a problem, because then eventually the liver will start to put it into the bloodstream, and that will cause what we call jaundice, which you see sometimes in young babies, but it can also happen in adults as well. And it can be caused by some different things, but in the end, it's not a good situation to be in. So that's the rest of the overview of the organs of the alimentary canal, and then also the accessory organs of the digestive system.